Welcome back. This, if you remember from yesterday's video, is the channel that uses Nyaya, an ancient Hindu technique for debate which focuses on uncovering truth rather than winning arguments, to the art and science of thinking clearly. So today we're going to think clearly by questioning some implied assumptions in the model I had to achieve EFI, early financial independence. So if you remember, my model was pretty simple. Save 40% from day one, buy strips of cash flow outside your retirement account when the annual cash flow is 7 times what you need. Quit your job, use your leisure to pursue education and culture as a means of self-actualization, being all you can be. Now, implied in that model is cost structure. So when I say 7 times what you need is a cost structure. So if you remember, I define wealth as passive income greater than your cash burn, which is passive income greater than your costs. So the lower your cost of living, in effect, the earlier you'll retire. So I wanted to tell this story in terms of 2 characters, Leonard and Gayle. So Leonard was a buddy of mine from Salomon Brothers. We were one of 5 in the world selected for the Salomon Brothers trading training program, which was written about in the book Liar's Poker. Now, I have to admit, I was the least distinguished of the 5 that were selected. I mean, somebody's got to be in the bottom 1%, as I try to remind my wife. And Leonard was not in the bottom 1%. He made eventually millions of dollars in bonuses. But what was interesting is he lived very simply. And every time he used to talk to me, he would call me the fool. He wouldn't address me by my name. He'd say, "Fool, how are you today?" Now, I normally wouldn't put up with that, except there was a lot to admire with Leonard. He's from Jamaica. He came here as an immigrant. He put himself through engineering school, ended up working at Los Alamos laboratories, actually calculating the trajectory of missiles. So he was a literal rocket scientist. He eventually went to top 10 business school, started his own software company that valued derivatives, which are the most complex financial instruments out there. The valuation is essentially applied mathematics. That's the area I ended up in, derivatives arbitrage. And he was just a smart guy. So I didn't understand why he called me a fool, and he kept on calling me a fool for most of my life. Until that point that I discussed in the first video, where I realized that I was really financially free. I just was running my life badly. That is, I could sell 95% of what I owned, create a perpetual passive cash flow, and in effect, live a life of leisure, pursuing education and culture. So once I did that, I called him up, and for the first time, he didn't call me a fool. He said, "Now you've stopped being a fool." And so I said to him, "Leonard, what changed?" And his answer was, "You finally understood that costs are something you can control while revenues are not." So that leads me on to the story of Gayle. Gayle was a personal assistant of mine once. And after we both left the firm that we worked at, she eventually fell on very hard times. So Gayle today is 67 years old. She lives on Social Security, about $1,000. She lives in Manhattan. She has to work with the city government because the numbers don't add up. But she consistently spends more than she earns, so she has an accumulating credit card debt. So she is, as I described in my first video, what I was, which is a debt and wage slave. Now, she could get herself out of this slavery because she inherited an apartment in Manhattan from her mother. And that apartment has no mortgage on it. There's just a monthly maintenance fee. So she could sell that apartment, turn it into perpetual cash flow, supplement her current $12,000 a year in Social Security, and she could actually lead a very good life in a place outside the US. And that's what I want to talk to you about today, is that the key is to have cash flow that's greater than your burn of cash, greater than the expenditure of your cash. So if Gayle were to move to Georgetown, Penang in Malaysia, she could live very well on $12,000 a year. She could easily have a house, garden, 3 meals a day, a little bit of money for culture and entertainment, and $12,000 is more than enough. She wouldn't even have to get a roommate. But Gayle chooses not to do that. And we go back to Jeremy Bentham, who was this economist that was very important in economic history, who developed this concept of marginal utility. And the concept of marginal utility is that we all have core values, we all have things we like and we dislike. And so the trade-offs we make are dependent on our own value system. And therefore, no two people are alike. So I can't criticize Gayle for not going to Georgetown, Penang, or any place else, because ultimately she values being in the city she's only known. She's never lived anywhere else. And the dx over dy, the trade-off she's willing to put up with, is that she values being near the things that she's grown up with more than living essentially a dignified life. And that's fine. Like I said in my last video, these are value judgments. I can't tell anybody how to live. I can just talk about what worked for me. So the takeaway from the applied assumption of cost structure is that in my model, you've got to earn in dollars and spend in weak currencies, usually outside the US. In fact, definitely outside the US. And then you can retire earlier. So you've got to get control over spending to retire earlier. So anybody with a certain minimum amount of capital can really retire. They choose not to, through the dx over dy of their consumption patterns. So that's the thought for the day. I will see you in the next video.